The second half of our meeting this evening, which is our speaker, and we're very pleased to welcome Malcom Graham, who is a local historian who some of you may have come across in other contexts or known in the past. I'm going to leave Malcom to introduce what he wishes about himself, but we're very interested in what he's got to say. We particularly like his choice of title, because I think a lot of people looked at that and thought, oh yes, I'll come and listen. So thank you very much, Malcom. I'll leave you to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, good evening, everyone. Having got you here, I don't talk about something completely different. But the Maggots to Prosecco, I perhaps ought to explain, just to get that over with. In 1914, 37 residents from Canal Street petitioned the City Council about, quote, the abominable stench arising from two slaughterhouses situated in close proximity in Canal Street. Offal and entrails are often left until nearly putrid, and maggots are frequently seen crawling on the public footpath. So if you have complaints about Jericho today, it's not half as bad as it was in 1914. The Prosecco side of it, I mean, doesn't need a lot of explanation, but I was, about the time that Jenny contacted me about coming tonight, there was a piece in the Oxford Mail about a local restaurant stressing how much Prosecco they got through, and it just struck me there was a sort of incredible contrast between the maggoty pavements of 1914 and the Prosecco-strewn setup of today. That would have been unthinkable even a few decades ago. I first, I think, took a group round Jericho in about 1972 as a sort of callow youth, and a guy came out of one of the houses, not particularly happily, and he asked if I was bringing people round the slums, which is what he obviously thought the area was. And it's just incredible that it's changed so much in 40 years. So that's got the explanation out of the way. What I've chosen to do tonight is just to take you, work this thing, yes, I've got it going the right way, to take you through the history of Jericho with a lot of illustrations, some of which I took myself, although not ones as quite as old as this. My earliest photographs of Jericho were taken in 1971, and they now look incredibly historic, but they don't get you back to the 1860s. I should perhaps say that I've been assisted in my inquiries by the use of the new Picture Oxen website, which the County Council has started. And if you want to look at photographs of Jericho, there are now hundreds on this Picture Oxen site, including mine, which previously have been sort of accessible, but not directly accessible.
What did you say, Picture Oxen?
Picture Oxen.
Oxen,
yeah. Right, so we begin at the site where the name Jericho really originates. I'll get my red thingy going. The Jericho House pub, rebuilt in the 1860s, probably on the site of the Wayside Inn, where Anthony Wood and a Mr. Stevens spent sixpence in 1668. And Anthony Wood, the historian and diarist, mentions Jericho then for the first time. The people in front of this pub are supposed to be Joseph Higgins and his family. Higgins ran the Jericho House for many years, and he also ran the brewery, which was conveniently situated on the other side of Jericho Street. And further down, you'll see one of Jericho's many pubs, then the Prince of Wales. So this is a sort of late 1860s photograph, probably, of a street that's, I'm sure, very familiar to all of you. I want to take you back now to the 1790s, to the Richard Davis map of Oxford and Oxfordshire. This was a bit of cut and paste of a different sort. I literally had to scan two separate maps. He very inconveniently divides Jericho up. but you can see how little there was in the late 18th century. Worcester College down there, and then Walton Street going up to the site of, I guess, the Jericho House and other buildings right at the top there. The only other buildings around are the new workhouse of the 1770s, which is now lost under Wellington Square, and the few buildings just north of Worcester College, which are still there. So all these fields just empty, but you've got the crucial addition of the Oxford Canal open to the wharf in Hyde Bridge Street at the beginning of 1790, and that, of course, was a great incentive to the development of Jericho. This was a photograph I took back in August 1971, and it's amazing how things have changed since then. This, of course, is Lucy's Eagle Iron Works, and it was a very nicely placed and rather attractive narrow boat, just happened to be there, and the light was all right. So I was very enchanted by this view. But the presence of the canal encouraged William Carter, who founded the business that went on to become Lucy's, to move to this canal side premises in the 1820s, having started off in Somertown. And by the early 1820s there was a boat building dock and a few houses up at Walton Well. So you already had the sort of nucleus of development up at that end of Jericho. And then in 1825, the major change, the University Press buys a plot of land from a guy who was actually the rector of Great Torrington in Devon, a chap called the Reverend Peter Wellington Firth. I've forgotten quite how he happened to have land in Jericho, but it obviously didn't mean a lot to him, lost in the nice hillsides of West Devon. And he was quite happy to sell this land to the press for several £1,000s. And they built, over the next 4 years, this grandiose factory in what was still fields in the sort of northwest corner of Oxford. This is a view from 1832 showing the completed building, and still the sort of passage of flocks of sheep along Walton Street. Charming view. This was such a huge different scale from the operation tucked away in the Clarendon building, and it meant a sort of demand obviously for housing, and that helped to fuel the growth of Jericho. But one has to remember at the time that Oxford was growing quite fast, and there was a lot of development going on in St Ives and St Clement's and around Gloucester Green, and of course around Beaumont Street. So Jericho wasn't solely down to the press, I don't think. Now, there were two significant owners of land in the Jericho area. The area to the south of the press belonged to St John's College, and so did the very north end of Jericho, but the area in the middle belonged to this guy Firth. St John's began to develop their land to the south in the mid-1820s as well, and they leased properties along Walton Street from sort of Worcester Place right through to today's Walton Crescent and beyond, beginning in 1825. And these very nice houses were built by 1826 on the front, on the sort of main street frontage. Colleges were obliged, of course, to consider long-term life. I mean, the rector of Great Torrington just wanted the money, but for St John's it was obviously, they were in it for eternity, and they had to be cautious, and so you get the amazing fact that in about 100 yards from this Walton Street frontage to roughly where the Jewish synagogue is, took about 60 years to develop. So in about 5 minutes, you're covering something that took 60 years. which is quite amazing when you think of somewhere like the Great Western Park at Didcot, where masses of housing gets built in no time at all, really. So they started down here in the mid-1820s, and the beginnings of Worcester Place, Richmond Road and Walton Crescent were put in, and that lovely little lane, Walton Lane, at the back. But development hardly got beyond that for something like 30 years. Meanwhile, Firth was laying out the land to the north of the press for development down onto the sort of soggy fields of Jericho. And again, he started just by laying out the first street or two with a couple of cross streets, which one was called Union Street, it's now Hart Street, and one at the top, King Street, which I think has sort of been reborn. All these houses were built by the end of the 1820s. They survived into the 1970s, but they all went. I remember being rather sad at the time to see them go, because they were rather a nice block. But they went to create the playing fields for the new school, which was very much needed at the time. Most of the housing in Jericho was fairly well organised. Obviously, builders bought plots which might have been a varied width, say 9 feet, 10 feet, 12 feet wide, and they just built a house on that plot. Or perhaps they bought 2 plots and built 3 houses on them. But this builder, I don't think I've ever identified who he was, managed to buy several plots in Cardigan Street and Jericho Street, and on those plots he crammed 24 cottages, which were called Jericho Gardens from what had been there before. There obviously wasn't much garden in them. They just had this very narrow passage, and then they were just a one-up, one-down cottage. Forgotten how many cases of cholera. 22 cases of cholera occurred in that block in 1832, so that's within a few years of them being built. Having said that, their drainage and water supply and everything was ultimately improved, and they survived until 1937, when they were finally demolished in some clearance, and the site was used for air raid shelters during the war. But this was, I think, the only example in Jericho of such sort of gross overdevelopment, although it was quite common in St Clement's and St Ebbs as well. Now this is down at the bottom of Walton Crescent. There's a wonderful sort of junction with Albert Street and Nelson Street, and this was a picture I took in 1972 when you still had gas lamps in Oxford. Really lovely feature. And you also were having drainage work 100 years after the main drainage of Jericho was completed. The drains, the sewers were rebuilt, so in a way it was like going back 100 years. There were great holes, excavations all over the place. But this is a great picture because it shows this, where you are here is St John's land, and where you are there was the sort of bottom end of the First estate, which Henry Ward, the coal merchant, acquired from First, and he began to develop this property beyond the wall of St John's in the early 1840s. The Carpenter's Arms is one of the many lost pubs of Jericho. Albert Street was initially known as Ward's Fields, and it was a very unpleasant place to live. This is a map from Ormrod's Sanitary Condition of Oxford in 1848, and it's a fairly good example of the sort of Maggoty side of Jericho. You can see all the way down an open drain, which and beside the press all the way there, and then Ward's fields are here on the other side of the drain. So presumably they had to leap the drain to get home. There was no way out for these people through the St John's estate. They had to find their way back up to Clarendon and down here. This was like a sort of early cut-slow wall, in a way, the drain plus the wall. So, fortunately for the people of Jericho, all the ordure went into Worcester College garden. And so the chairman of the Oxford local board happened to be the provost of Worcester. So things moved fairly fast. And Jericho was drained in 1849, 1850, not into a sort of modern sewage system, but into the river further down and out of the way of both Worcester College and Jericho. So that did improve Jericho quite a bit, and it enabled Mr. Ward and his successors to develop the sort of rest of low-lying Jericho. Meanwhile, various facilities were being provided for Jericho people, not necessarily that they wanted them, but it was thought they ought to have them, like St Paul's Church, Oxford's only Greek revival church, built in 1836. Thomas Combe, again, as he would be with St Barnabas, was behind the building of this, building designed by H.J. Underwood. And I've shown this wonderful aerial photograph of OUP, which comes out of the Changing Faces of Jericho book, which I expect some of you at least will have seen. I put it here because of the school that used to sit at the back end of the press. This was the Greycoat Charity School. It was a charity set up by the university in 1708, and it was originally in the parish of St Peter in the east. In the early 19th century they moved it to St Aldate's, and then in about 1830 they moved to this huge barn-like stone building behind the press. And that building, huge as it is, you wouldn't have thought you could fit 350 boys into it, but that was what they tried to do, and it certainly housed 300. So they were crammed in there, and this was seen as a sort of model for the parish schools that were developing around Oxford. In fact, it was so successful that the parish schools ultimately took away its trade, and from 300 boys it ended up with 20 by the time it closed in 1860. So that was where the boys of Jericho initially went to school. The girls went to this rather fine school in Walton Street. I photographed this in a time when I was naive enough to imagine I might actually be able to afford to buy it. But of course Somerville College got there a lot faster than I would have done, and I think they bought it in 72. But this was, consciously designed fairly near to St Paul's Church, St Paul's Girls and Infant School, designed by a man called Thomas Grimsley, who was a local St Giles sculptor and specialist in terracotta. And you can still see terracotta decoration in the side of the building, but originally it was designed entirely with structural terracotta, which he said would save the cost of carpenters' bills. Unfortunately, the terracotta didn't last that long, so they had to get the carpenters in eventually. Another structure, or another site that appeared in the 1840s was St Sepulchre's Cemetery, and I was just in time to arrive in Oxford to record the last years of the chapel which used to sit there. Rather a nice neo-Norman chapel, again designed by H.J. Underwood. That was built in 1848. That site, of course, is now clear, and the site around it has changed considerably with the loss of Lucy's and its replacement. So by 1850, you get Hogarth's map of Oxford, which is the first sort of really detailed map of the whole city. So there's Worcester College, here's Grafton and Lucy's, I think it was by this time. There's the cemetery, and here's the sort of first estate. There's the OP, Ward's Fields, by now slightly drained, just down here, and then the beginnings of the St John's houses and the fort, Richmond Road, Worcester Place there. So a really great map, and we see this almost exactly the same date. A German called Karl Wundt comes to Oxford, and unlike most visitors to Oxford who just went round the colleges, he sort of strode off up the canal, and he records this view from the canal across the site of Jericho towards the observatory and towards OUP, and you've even got some pollution coming from the chimneys of the steam presses in the University Press. He also records, as Mark Davis well knows, the boatman's chapel down at Hythe Bridge. Again, something which people just didn't notice. It's absolutely wonderful. So during the 1850s, you get a continuation of development onto this now reasonably well-drained lower levels of Jericho. So you get an extension of Great Clarendon Street down towards the canal, and then Ward's Fields evolve into Albert Street, and so head off up north. And you get sort of characteristic Jericho developments of corner shops, like this one, and obviously the corner pubs, which we'll be seeing. This is another of my 1972 health and safety photographs. This is massive excavations again on the corner of Canal Street and Great Clarendon. The boys' school built for St Paul's Boys in 1856, and then sort of handed over to St Barnabas when the parish was created in 1869. St Paul's were a bit badly done by. They built this rather splendid school, and then they had to go and build another one in Jackson Street in 1873, which has since gone. And another of the many grocers' shops which were just about closing down as I wandered around in the early 70s. This is Smart's. And towards the top end of Canal Street, you reach Cranham Street, and you reach the 1860s. It took that long to sort of creep up the area, and you get these wonderful sort of Gothic-y windows to the houses here. I did at one time sort of begin to think I could establish who designed these, but we're talking about the time before builders had to deposit plans with the city engineer, so it's quite difficult to know who was doing what where. But there was a builder called Edwin Patrick, I think, who was doing quite a lot of properties around here, and I suspected it was him. But they're really attractive, and obviously worth rather more now than they were in 72. And this is looking up Cardigan Street towards the lost Radcliffe maternity home, but we're looking past so many things here. We're looking at the side of St Barnabas Church, built in the late 1860s, the Crown Pub, my favourite pub name, the Cottage of Content, on the other corner, and then a sort of temperance structure, the St Barnabas Institute of 1892, provided by a North Oxford lady called, what was her name? Not Miss Jeffson, I think, but the North Oxford people were very much involved in philanthropic activity in Jericho, and this was a place where men could get away from their families and drink. Get away from drink, I don't mean get away to drink. They gave them somewhere to recreate without boozing. And then further up the street, that tall roof line is St Barnabas Girls' School by the same architect as the church, Arthur Blomfield. A sad loss in the 70s. It survived until then. And here we have a photograph of St Barnabas Church, more or less the same view that you were looking at with the splendid new development around it. This must date from very early in the 1870s. The building was built in 1868-9 and the campanile was added in 1872. So I wouldn't think it's very much later than that. Fascinating building, and it gave me a huge pleasure to get to Venice many years after I originally saw it, and having told people for years it was sort of based on Torcello near Venice, to actually get to Torcello and see that it did look rather like St Barnabas Church. So, but a lovely church, founded by Thomas Combe, who said, he wanted 1,000 people to be accommodated for as little money as possible. So it was a very, very bargain basement building in many ways. All the decorations really inside, but wow, isn't it fantastic? So we get to the 1860s, and St John's, who've been sort of sitting on this close to the south of the AUP for all this time, are suddenly energised by the prospect of a carriage factory coming to Oxford. There was a sort of a great excitement in 1865, and the thought that the Great Western were going to build a carriage factory, ironically where the Roger Dudman Way flats now are. And St John's thought, wow, this may be bad for the university, but it's jolly good for us as local landowners. So they got their architect, William Wilkinson, to come up with a scheme for extending Walton Crescent, Richmond Road, towards the wall at the west end. And they also laid out Kingston Road in anticipation of all these artisans coming to Oxford. And of course the scheme was founded, and the carriage works went to Swindon. But some houses were built as a result, and I'm pretty sure they were designed by Wilkinson himself. Lovely houses with this polychromatic brickwork. Some of them have got stone and decorated brick, but charming buildings, and obviously worth a lot more than when cars like this were parked here.
Is that the Morris 1100, is it?
It may be. You're probably better on cars than I am. But yeah. So up at the top end of Jericho, again we move on to college land, and they set out the Jericho Gardens area for building in 1863, and so you get houses here with the Radcliffe Arms on the left and yet another corner shop, and properties built all the way up to Walton Street. On the left, halfway up, there was a wonderful building called the North Oxford Working Men's Club, which again was a sort of philanthropic way of getting the chaps out of pubs and into somewhere where they could sort of drink a cup of coffee and read a book or listen to an improving lecture such as this. But most of them preferred to be down at the Radcliffe Arms, I suspect. Junction Street is very late. It's a sort of St John's got the gleam in their eye about developing this in the early 1870s, and they laid out sort of half the road and built terraced houses by 1873. But then they sort of waited for about 4 years before finishing off Junction Street. This was taken in the early 70s, and this was obviously after an attempt to sort of turn them into 1960s houses, complete with sort of what I always used to call lavatory fencing. I don't know where I got that term from, but it was, instead of having decent railings, you just had this sort of timber fencing, which would probably decay within about 5 years. And then all the nice brickwork was painted over. But, this was a late piece of work on the St John's estate. By 1876, you get the first really detailed ordnance survey of Oxford on a scale of 1 to 500, and it shows down here, this is Ward's Fields, still separated by the wall from the St John's estate, and still a gap which hadn't been filled. This area apparently was used by boys from the press who would settle their arguments pugilistically in the lunch break on this bit of field. But those times were up, because in 1876 the wall came down and this enormous commercial block was built on that corner, Eastern Stores, in 1972, but for long now a Lebanese restaurant, which I'm sure you will all have patronised. Quite interesting actually that Walton Street had the earliest Asian shop in Oxford in the 1880s. There was a guy who was born in Benares, I think, and he comes to Oxford and he sets up a shop in Walton Street, and then he moves it down to St Hebb Street, and then he disappears. But his was the earliest Asian shop in Oxford. Pubs. I counted up today, defining Jericho as being this side of Walton Street and the sort of bounded by the canal, Worcester Place, Walton Well Road. There was something like 18 pubs, and one of them was the New Inn, which was at the bottom of Nelson and Wellington Street. I remember spending a New Year's Eve in there many years ago, but it's not been a pub for many years. Another attempt to keep people away from the boozer was the drinking fountain which William Ward had erected up in Walton Well Road in 1888. Rather a sad thing now, because obviously no water is provided there, and it's a bit unkempt, but a very beautiful structure. So I've said that Jericho's drainage was improved, but this wasn't always the case. And this picture, rather alarmingly given that we're moving into summer, was taken in June 1955 in Cardigan Street. The interesting thing about flooding is that nowadays, because we all have so much stuff, it's a real problem. But in the old days, children particularly, but even the mums, managed to find it quite amusing. I mean, it was a bit different when all you had to do was carry a few tables and chairs upstairs. It's a bit different when you've got carpet and electronics and all the rest. But this was a sort of perspective on Jericho. It was a very different place, as I've said, in the mid-20th century. And indeed, this photograph I took from the new footbridge, looking up past Juxon Street Wharf towards Lucy's in 1974. And if you sort of think how different that view is today, Jericho was just so different. In 1953, the city development plan envisaged clearing the whole lot and turning it into sort of light industrial units. So it would have suffered somewhat similarly to poor old St Ebbs. But fortunately, Olive Gibbs, who was present at the unveiling of her blue plaque down in St Thomas's the other week, and the church and local people fought off the more dreadful schemes. And eventually, in the 60s, the city adopted a much more positive approach of rehabilitation and just selective demolition. I think now probably some of the selection would have been questioned. I mean, these were houses in Nelson Street which went in the 70s. Lovely brickwork. One has to say they were incredibly narrow. I think there was one that was only 9 feet wide. But I think there are one or two that are still as narrow as that. It has to be said that these properties, for all their faults, were affordable houses back in the time that they were built. And they were occupied by people just sort of coming in from the countryside, and they certainly weren't having to sort of work for 40 years to save up a mortgage. So there is that to be said for them. So Jericho begins to be upgraded in the 70s, gentrified, I suppose you could say. But who would have ever expected that Lucy's would fold or decide to fold and turn into a sort of huge property company in the area, and you'd get a sort of massive development like this on the site of the works. I mean, this is roughly, this is a photograph taken in 2008, more or less from where I was standing back in 1971 with the narrow boat and the foundry behind it. And I end with a picture taken, I think, in 72, showing the boatyard as it then was, which makes a sort of interesting counterpoint with that wonderful view of what you hope to get if the 45 or whatever it was conditions are met, which will be the end of a very long and difficult saga that you've all gone through. Thank you very much.